So James,
Yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
It's a IP I am familiar with, but in terms of my actual knowledge of how the game works, my knowledge of that is limited entirely to Stranger Things. That's all my exposure to it has been.
Do you remember at uni, near where we used to rehearse plays in Falmer, there would be the D&D society that would meet. I remember this release. Is it Falmer?
I don't remember it. But
where did you perform Grey Skies? What was that room called?
Wasn't it Mandela Hall?
Mandela Hall. So do that at that building. You know where everyone would wait to audition and stuff?
Yes,
in
the
that
wooden,
shared
the wooden
space,
bit. Yeah.
There was a D&D society. And that is my only experience of D&D. Have no sense of like, oh, it's a good or bad thing. Yeah. I never encountered it, and it never encountered me. I'm into plenty of nerdy shit myself, so who am I to say like that would be out of my sphere of thing? But in terms of like my understanding of Dungeons and Dragons, it's completely non-existent. If there were references in this film to something, I wouldn't have got them, right?
Okay.
And look, I think since you and I started this podcast, however many months ago, there are certain films which I'm seeing in the cinema that I probably would have either not seen or waited for them to come out on streaming or another version. This is one of those films where I'm like, okay, film's out this week. Why don't I just go and see this? And typically, those films that I tend to would not have seen or rushed to see in the cinema. 65. Maybe Ant-Man Quantumania I would have waited because of the reviews. I can usually sort of sense that I'm kind of seeing them to have a good discussion on the podcast, have some fun.
We're doing it for you guys.
To get ahead. Maybe my audience is interested in hearing it, and it's good for the SEO of the show. And this is definitely one of those films. And I think there is definitely, for me personally, something about the look of it in the trailer kind of gave me the ick before I went in. Both in like the potentially heavy reliance on CG and the slightly generic feel of what I think it's going for. Did you think that's fair? There's something icky about it?
Totally. And actually, not to just diverge from that point, but I have that feeling you've had. Is exactly how I feel about that film Renfield that's coming out.
Right, yeah.
Which I think sounds like an interesting idea, but when I saw the trailer,
and it's
see the
wrong
poster,
to do that, right?
It's got generic studio fingerprints all over it.
Yes,
That's taken off any interesting element to it. So yeah, I thought about Dungeons and Dragons, but
studio fingerprint is an interesting thing.
But I like Chris Pine.
But I think when someone is saying we're going to make Dungeons & Dragons, which is an IP that I don't have a connection to or any sort of association with, look, you're going to cast Chris Pine is your lead, right? Which is already a very good step in the right direction. It also stars Sophie Lillis, Michelle Rodriguez, Reggae John Page, Justice Smith, and Hugh Grant.
These Rodriguez, they're trying to murder me.
It's just a million Michelle Rodriguez. Hugh Grant is in it. I did, funnily enough, listen to Mark Kermo's review, and he said that some of the scenes are CG and some of them are real, but Hugh Grant is chewing them up anyway, which I thought was quite interesting. Okay, so let's just talk about what this film's about. So we have a fantasy heist film. Okay. And Chris Pine and his gang of mates are thieves, but they're good thieves. And they, on a way to go and steal a thing, they accidentally unleash a much greater evil. So therefore, they have to go and steal something back to stop the world ending.
Sounds like the Guardians of the Galaxy.
So about halfway through this movie, I was realizing, okay, so it's like a ragtag group of very disparate people all coming together for a shared common goal, but they realize like their humanity through like, and I was like, oh, it's Guardians of the Galaxy, which was kind of a new hope, and tracing it back. So if you stripped sci-fi out of this and you just applied fantasy, it took me an hour and 10 minutes to be like, it's Guardians. It's Guardians minus like the 80s cassette music. Okay, so this film is 2 hours and 15 minutes, and I will not dock it for that runtime because despite me going in with the ick, it was consistently entertaining and funny. It is funnier than any Marvel film I've seen, at least for I don't know how many years, but like I'm saying it was laugh out loud, funny, consistently throughout.
That's great.
And I think that, I go into Dungeons and Dragons, know nothing about it. This film has to It has to be entertaining, and it probably should be funny. And it does kind of do those. I will dock points for it being very generic, right? There's very few new ideas. I don't think there was a theme apart from be good. Do you know what I mean? When you're thinking like, what's this really about? Apart from like just, at least Fast films about family. Like, what is it got to say? And it really doesn't have anything to say, but I can't really go, I'm not going to be annoyed at this film because it passed my time really well and I had a good time with it. what I'm realizing when I've seen things like, or just like other big blockbuster films that are throwing in comedy there, it's actually really hard to find a line between being a spoof or a parody or just like taking your world seriously and being funny. And I think this film is actually, it does take, it's not like a parody of Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
And from what I've heard, people who do like Dungeons and Dragons have not poo-pooed it. They're like, oh yeah, no, this is like true to the material. And so I'm watching this and I'm like, oh, it's not just a piss take. It's funny, but it takes its world seriously enough for me to also care about what's happening. And I talked about it being a heist movie. And, you know, we've got magic and rules, which I don't know about. And it's quite good at setting up its own magic and its own rules and things that you know you can't do, but now we have this MacGuffin, we're able to do that now. And when that comes in later, I'm like, oh yeah, of course, like you mentioned that, and that now makes sense, and that's fun that you brought in this element. Like, I don't know if you ever played Portal.
No,
there's like this idea of like, you know, like this whole like thing that you can do with Portal, and it doesn't overstay its welcome with ideas. The Reggae John Page sequence is like he's in a good like sort of 25 minutes in the middle, and he's a really great comedic foil to the other characters, and he's funny. And then just when like his character probably runs out of steam, he leaves and you never see him again. And I'm like, oh, he was such a great comedic presence in this. He's an actor I've never really found like that engaging. And yeah, halfway through I was like, this is Guardians, and that's why it's working. They've gone, we'll take that idea and put it into a fantasy high setting, and that's why it's done. There are both Dungeons and Dragons, and there are scenes with dragons in the dungeon.
Good.
The CG's not great, and it's pretty rubbery. I'm realizing that no one's really going to do a dragon better than The Hobbit: Desolation of Smaug, and that was pretty obvious in terms of like CG and like.
Is the Game of Thrones dragons not as good as that?
I'd say Game of the Thrones, when they got budget,
they got loads of dragons.
Yes, in the new ones they got low budget, but like I'd say earlier on, the dragons were a bit rubbery.
What about Shrek?
Yeah, the best dragon scene. Yeah. That was such a like staple dragon fairy tale scene in Shrek, isn't it? It's like the classic, Bridge for the Lava. And that's it. I said this to some people at the pub. They're like, what have you seen recently? And I said, Dungeons and Dragons, and it's not awful. And people are like, really? And I'm like, yeah, like I could hardly recommend you see it, but it's really inoffensive.
On that point, Declan writes in to hello@pulpkitchenpodcast.com and says, I want to give you my exclusive first thoughts on the new Dungeons and Dragons film. Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, I should say. I was lucky enough to get to an unlimited secret screening and was worried it'd be something I wasn't too excited for. But this new D&D movie, let me tell you, actually solid. Yeah. He's written it like that. Yeah. Non-spoilers, obviously, but something that really stands out is that for me, which might be a film confession, is that which might be a controversial opinion, I find Lord of the Rings overwhelming as a fantasy tale because there's so much lore in that opening montage.
Respect that, but I don't agree.
And I struggle to keep up with the world building, which for me feels more like rules to remember. In Dungeons and Dragons, it's beautiful how comforting it feels not to be overwhelmed, getting information about the world in small spurts, and only when necessary to the plot, it feels natural. It's quite funny and got a great cast, but as someone who's just wrapped as someone who has just wrapped on their first short film, congratulations, I was in love with the really dynamic shots and compositions. Just something cool to appreciate. Don't want to say too much more at the risk of spoiling your initial experience, but I look forward to hearing what you both think. Personally, I'd say 4 out of 5 stars as a solid go with your mates movie.
It takes no risks. That's where I dock points. It's like, yes, you're safe and you've drawn from great things. You've taken no risks. Hugh Grant is doing what I thought was an impression of Boris Johnson.
Really?
Because he's doing like this, like the vocalization and the voice. Like he's good fun. He's doing this Paddington thing basically, but in fancy. And I was like, he's just doing Boris Johnson. He's playing like a politician who lies to get ahead politically. He just starts doing Boris in the middle of it, which I found quite funny. So that's probably all I'll say on it. But yeah.
Well, if you've seen Dungeons and Dragons, Honor Among Thieves, like Declan has and like James has, write in and let us know your thoughts.
Do you know what? If you are lucky to be stuck with Dungeons and Dragons, do you know what I mean? If all the films to be stuck on, you're
great playing movie.
Yeah,
great playing movie. Okay, perfect. You know what? I will be honest. If I see that, I won't go see it at the cinema. But if I see that come onto streaming, and it's a Sunday, that will be near the top of my list to go. I'll put that on. Yeah. Easy. It takes no risks, therefore it cannot offend me.
It's like watching a film on the easiest setting of a game, which is the opposite to my next one, which I'm going to talk about, which is Infinity Pool.